Beth had been staring at the private jets outside the glass wall of O'Hare Airport for more than 20 minutes. Her economy flight to Seattle had been delayed 3 times already, and when the 4th announcement echoed through the terminal, a man in a black suit approached her with an impossible offer. Mr. Rourke invited her to join him. A private flight, departing in 30 minutes, direct to Napa. She should have laughed it off, shaken her head, and gone back to waiting at her gate like any ordinary traveler. Instead, she searched his name on her phone, sent his information to her daughter with a message that said, if she went missing, call the police, and then she followed a stranger toward a waiting Gulf Stream. Because sometimes, the most unforgettable stories begin with a hopelessly delayed flight. That afternoon, O'Hare smelled of expensive coffee and the quiet frustration of hundreds of passengers drifting between late departures. Elizabeth Carter, 48 years old, had been at gate F12 since 3 o'clock, with a single carry-on suitcase, a cup of melted iced tea, and a guidebook to Seattle she had not yet opened. Everything had been planned for weeks. Arrive early, rest overnight at a small hotel by the harbor. Yet after more than 5 hours, the only thing she could do was sit and watch the sleek private planes taxiing past the large window. The Chicago sky was heavy and gray. The sun had long disappeared behind the glass towers. Yellow lights on the terminal floor cast a dim reflection on Beth's face as she leaned her forehead against the cool glass, eyes following a private jet that had just landed near the executive hangar. It was the kind of plane that made people think of one word: luxury. Its polished body gleamed under the floodlights, the retractable staircase unfolding with effortless grace. A man stepped out from the terminal door, tall, wearing a charcoal overcoat, his stride purposeful yet unhurried. Even from a distance, through the fogged glass, Beth could sense something different about him. Perhaps it was confidence, or the quiet authority in his movements, or maybe the way people near him instinctively shifted aside without realizing they had done so. When he stopped at the bottom of the stairs, he lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers through the pane, across several dozen yards of tarmac. For a few suspended seconds, time seemed to stop. Then he turned away and climbed the steps. Beth blinked, returning to reality. Strange, she thought. Perhaps it was hunger and fatigue playing tricks on her, a wealthy man glancing toward the economy passengers in the terminal. A familiar story in the modern world. She looked down at her phone, battery blinking red, scrolled through Seattle's weather report, then opened her messages intending to complain to her daughter but stopped. Instead, she pulled out her travel guide, turned to the section titled Affordable Eats in Downtown, trying to make her wasted time feel useful. She did not expect that only minutes later, a man in a neatly tailored suit looking like high-end airport security would stand before her and speak gently. "Excuse me, Miss Carter? My name is Daniel. I work for Mr. James Rourke, the gentleman who just boarded that jet outside. He would like to invite you to fly with him to Napa. The plane departs in 30 minutes. No delays, no connections." Beth frowned. "I'm sorry, what?" Daniel handed her a thick business card embossed in gold. "Mr. Rourke noticed you've been waiting for quite some time. He thought you might prefer this flight instead of spending more hours here." There was no trace of humor or persuasion in his tone, only calm professionalism. Beth took the card. The gold letters read, Rourke Holdings, Napa Valley, California. She searched the name on her phone. The results appeared instantly. Jameson Rourke, real estate magnate, owner of resorts and vineyards across Northern California. No criminal records, no scandals, nothing suspicious. She sent all the information, including a photo of the business card, to her daughter with a half-joking message. "I've just been invited onto a private jet by a stranger. If you don't hear from me in 12 hours, call the police. His name's James Rourke. His assistant is Daniel. I'm considering it." Outside the window, the jet still waited, its amber lights blinking softly, almost expectant. The airport loudspeaker crackled again. "Flight 752 to Seattle will be further delayed. Estimated departure time, 10:45 p.m. We apologize for the inconvenience." Beth closed her eyes and sighed. A 4th delay. She would arrive in Seattle at dawn, miss the wedding, and be exhausted from a sleepless night in a cramped cabin. She looked at Daniel, then at the business card, then back at the plane. She stood up. "Let's go," she said quietly. "If I disappear, at least I'll have a good story to tell, or at least a decent warning for others." Beth Carter thought that night at O'Hare would bring nothing more than cold coffee and another delay. But one glance through a pane of glass changed everything. And you're listening to that story, a story that doesn't begin with roses or love songs, but with weariness that led, unexpectedly, to a private jet invitation. Before we follow Beth into the next chapter and the offer no one would dare imagine, take a second to subscribe to our channel, tap like if your heart just stirred a little, and share this video if you believe that a single encounter can change a life. Where are you listening from at home, on your commute, or perhaps in some airport corner like Beth on that long night? Comment below to let us know how far this story has traveled. And now, let's turn the page to the next chapter, the unbelievable invitation from a stranger. Daniel led Beth out of the waiting area and down a quiet hallway reserved for business travelers, where the lighting grew softer and the faint scent of oak replaced the crowded air and stale coffee of the main terminal. She felt as though she had stepped through a door into another world, one without loudspeakers, without endless lines, without the weary stares of stranded passengers. Everything here was quiet by design. 2 security officers nodded politely as Daniel scanned his badge. The glass doors slid open to reveal the waiting Gulfstream, its cabin lights spilling a warm amber glow onto the tarmac like an unspoken invitation. Beth descended the short ramp, her shoes meeting the cold concrete of the private runway, and somehow she felt calmer than she had all day inside the main concourse. The night air brushed against her face, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel mixed with a surge of excitement she hadn't felt in years. Daniel walked ahead, stopping at the foot of the aircraft stairs and gesturing for her to follow. Beth looked up into the open doorway of the plane, where the golden light shimmered across the polished walnut paneling and soft leather seats. She took a slow breath, then climbed each step, her curiosity and caution rising together. At the final step, she stopped. The man from earlier, James Rourke, was there. Closer now, clearer. He was tall, upright, with neatly combed silver-streaked hair, wearing a white shirt with rolled sleeves and a navy blazer draped casually over his shoulders. His gaze met hers without hesitation, without judgment. It was steady, as though he already knew who she was. "You came," he said, his voice low and distinct, carrying a trace of the East Coast with the lilt of Ireland. "I wasn't sure you would." Beth gave a half-smile, half-guarded look. "Neither was I. But my flight's been delayed for the 4th time, and I figured, if I'm going to be kidnapped, at least the kidnapper dresses well." James chuckled softly. "A perfectly reasonable point. I'm James Rourke." He extended his hand. Beth shook it firm but gentle. "Elizabeth Carter," she said. "Beth, if you prefer." He inclined his head slightly, smiling. "Please, have a seat. We'll be departing in 15 minutes. The cabin was spacious, arranged with 8 cream leather seats facing each other around a fixed wooden table. There was no hint of ostentation. Everything exuded quiet refinement, more like a private lounge than an aircraft. Beth chose a window seat and rested her hand lightly on the armrest, as if confirming to herself that this was real. James sat opposite her, maintaining a polite distance, offering no pressure. "I know this is unusual," he said, his tone softening, "but I saw you sitting there alone, tired, disappointed. I had a plane heading in your direction and thought, why not offer you a ride?" Beth studied him. "Do you often invite strangers onto your private jet?" James shook his head. "Never. This is the first time." The answer didn't make her less surprised, but it didn't make her afraid either. There was something about him, not wealth or composure, but a quiet steadiness, the kind carried by people who have learned to bear responsibility without complaint. Soon, a flight attendant appeared, smiling warmly. "Miss Carter, I'm Rachel. It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Would you like some tea, sparkling water, or perhaps a glass of Napa Valley Red?" Beth glanced between her and James. "You stock Napa wine on your plane?" James smiled. "I own a vineyard there." Beth laughed. "Then I'll have wine, and if I faint, at least it'll be from quality, not chloroform." James lifted his glass with a faint grin. "I appreciate your sense of humor." Beth took the offered glass, inhaled the rich scent of berries and oak, and tasted a slow sip. The wine was smooth and bold, far beyond anything she'd ever had before. The engines began to hum, a soft vibration beneath their feet. The plane moved, gliding slowly toward the private runway. Through the window, the airport lights drifted away as the night sky of Chicago opened ahead. Beth exhaled, resting her head against the seat. Anxiety still fluttered faintly in her chest, but underneath it was a calm she couldn't quite name. She had just boarded a stranger's private jet because of a glance through glass and a polite invitation. It defied every instinct of a middle-aged woman who had been divorced, betrayed, and had long learned to rely only on herself. Yet it was precisely that defiance that made her feel alive again, young, reckless, awake. Perhaps, as James had said, this wasn't madness at all, but a well-timed chance. The aircraft leveled off, the engines fading to a soft, distant murmur, like the low rhythm of a lullaby. Beth looked out the window, watching the city lights shrink into glittering threads against the dark. Part of her still couldn't believe she was here in a private jet, surrounded by cream leather and fine wine, across from a man who was both refined and quietly unreadable. James sat opposite, the gentle light tracing the edges of his face, catching the steel gray of his eyes that looked as though they'd seen too much yet gave nothing away. She wasn't sure what to say, so she finally asked, her voice calm but curious. "So, do you often fly alone like this?" James turned his glass slowly in his hand. The light reflected off the glass, casting a soft ring upon the polished wooden table. "Usually with an assistant or an associate," James said. "But not tonight. Everyone's already in Napa. I stayed behind for a last-minute meeting in Boston. This flight was meant to be a quiet one." Beth arched a brow, a faint smile playing at her lips. "And then you saw a woman staring at your plane through the glass and thought, 'I'll invite her aboard?'" He laughed quietly. "Not right away. I saw you waiting, saw you looking like you were fighting with yourself. And I thought, if I can make someone's bad day a little better, why not?" Beth tilted her head, half skeptical, half amused. "So you're the mysterious, kind-hearted man with a private jet?" James shrugged, his smile soft but unpretentious. "Not exactly. But I've had my share of wasted hours waiting for things that never came. I know what that feels like." He held her gaze as he said it, and for the first time, Beth felt something genuine beneath his calm exterior. In that moment, he wasn't a polished businessman in the quiet dark sky, but a man who had known solitude and the hollow ache of waiting for something that never arrived. Rachel returned, setting 2 dinner trays gently on the table. The main course was pasta with truffle cream and roasted vegetables, simple yet fragrant. Beth chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I thought I'd be having stale cookies and cold vending machine coffee tonight." James smiled, refilling her glass with unhurried ease. "Instead, you have a hot dinner and Cabernet from my vineyard. Not bad." Beth raised her glass and tapped it lightly against his. Not bad at all. They ate in a strangely easy silence. Neither tried to impress nor embellish, just 2 adults sharing an unexpected moment. Beth told him she worked as a freelance marketing consultant, mostly from home, with a daughter studying at a university in Wisconsin. James listened closely, nodding now and then, asking just enough to show he was genuinely interested. He didn't share much about himself, only that he managed a chain of hotels and resorts mostly in California, a few in Europe. She didn't pry, not because she wasn't curious, but because everything about him, even what he left unsaid, carried a quiet veil, as though he'd long practiced the art of keeping distance. Yet she found no discomfort in that. On the contrary, she felt seen, heard, in a way she hadn't for a long time. After dinner, as Rachel cleared the trays, they moved on to tea. James chose Earl Grey. Beth preferred mint. The air in the cabin seemed to slow. Gone were the small talks about work or weather. What remained were fragments of memory. Beth spoke of her first trip to New York at 22, when she got lost in Times Square. James told of a winter in Vermont when snow fell so thick he was stranded for 3 days in a cabin, no power, just a fireplace and a bottle of whiskey. They laughed, and the invisible distance between them shrank with each passing minute. Beth couldn't recall the exact moment she began to feel lighter. Maybe it was the sound of his voice, steady, low, like a late-night jazz tune. Maybe it was the way his eyes rested on her, patient and present, without judgment or haste. Or maybe it was simply being here, sipping wine, on a private jet, talking to a man who made her feel visible not as a divorced woman, not as a delayed passenger, but as herself. Elizabeth Carter. When the plane crossed the Rocky Mountains, James stood and poured them both more water. "Are you tired?" he asked. Beth shook her head. "Just a little overwhelmed. Everything happened so fast. He nodded, understanding, and smiled. Think of it as a turn in the road. The best surprises never fit into plans. She smiled back. Then this is the most interesting turn I've ever taken. His gaze lingered on her for a long second, thoughtful, but never intrusive. I hope so. The plane moved steadily through the night sky, between the stars, carrying two strangers who were slowly letting their guards fall. In that cabin, words were soft but real, and the distance between them closed not through proximity, but through presence. Honest, quiet, human. When the plane began its descent, Beth felt the shift in the air. The weightless blur of risk and wonder gave way to something tangible, nearer. Dawn was breaking, brushing the eastern horizon in a pale wash of gold. James sat across from her, one hand resting on the armrest, watching the sky with the ease of someone accustomed to greeting mornings at altitude. Rachel reappeared, her smile gentle. We'll be landing in 15 minutes, Miss Carter. Let me know if you need anything. Beth nodded, fastening her seatbelt and folding her coat. On the table, her tea had gone cold, but the faint scent of mint still lingered, an echo of the quiet peace that had settled over her just hours before. As the jet glided down onto the small airfield in Napa, sunlight spilled gently over the valley. Through the window, Beth saw vineyards stretching across the hills, lavender swaying in the breeze, and clusters of French-style villas nestled against the slopes. She had seen pictures of this place before on magazine covers, in travel guides, but never thought she'd arrive like this. Not after a decision she herself could hardly believe she'd made. The landing was smooth, barely a tremor. James stood first, slipping on his jacket, before turning to her. We're here. Ready for a quiet morning? Beth smiled. I think I've been ready since the moment I stepped on the plane. The door opened, and Napa air poured in fresh, earthy, tinged with grass, sunlight, and autumn's cool breath. At the foot of the stairs waited a black SUV, door open, driver in a tailored suit standing by. Good morning, Mr. Rourke. The driver spoke softly, and James gave a slight nod before gesturing for Beth to step in first. They didn't drive far. About 20 minutes later, the car turned onto a cobblestone path lined with towering eucalyptus trees. At the end of the road, a house appeared like something drawn out of a quiet dream. A Mediterranean villa with terracotta roof tiles, soft yellow walls wrapped in ivy, and a large mahogany door gleaming in the morning light. In the courtyard, a stone fountain murmured beside a trellis of heavy grapevines, tended by a few gardeners with calm, unhurried gestures. Beth caught her breath. She had never seen a place that felt this peaceful. James opened the door and led her inside. The interior was rustic yet refined. Dark oak floors, hand-woven wool rugs, oil paintings, and old black and white photographs framed in wood. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the kitchen. This is my home, James said, his voice steady and low. And today, if you wish, it can be a place for you to rest before deciding where to go next. Beth turned to him. What do you mean? His smile was gentle, unpressing, sincere. I'm not expecting anything, but I thought, maybe you need somewhere to stop, just for a while, to breathe. Something in the way he said it, in that quiet, deliberate kindness, made it impossible to refuse. She nodded. Just one day, she said. James smiled. One day is a good start. That afternoon, they sat on the terrace overlooking the vineyard, glowing gold beneath the soft, late sunlight. On the table rested two glasses of red wine, slices of soft cheese, and fresh grapes picked from the garden behind them. James spoke about the vines, the climate of Napa, and the harvest season when the whole valley filled with the scent of ripe fruit and laughter. Beth listened, sometimes asking, sometimes just letting the rhythm of his voice merge with the whisper of leaves overhead. The sunset poured a honeyed warmth across the hills. She leaned back, wine in hand, and felt her heart lighten. Never in her life had she imagined that a delayed flight, a glance through a window, and a stranger's invitation could lead her here to the Napa Valley, beside a man she barely knew, with her heart slowly, quietly warming again. Beth woke the next morning as sunlight slipped through the curtains and touched the cream-colored sheets. The guest room she stayed in faced west, its wide window opening to a view so still it felt unreal. Outside stretched endless vineyards, draped in a fine veil of mist like a mourning silk shawl. Beyond them, rolling hills dusted in the pale gold of early autumn. She sat up slowly, sliding the silk blanket aside, her bare feet meeting the cool wooden floor. The first feeling was strangeness, the next was calm. It had been so long since she'd slept deeply, no alarms, no worries, no half-finished dreams of work or unfinished lives. The faint aroma of coffee drifted through the hallway, pulling her gently from the softness of morning. She wrapped a cardigan around her shoulders and stepped out barefoot, her hair still tousled from sleep. The house was quiet, but not silent. Somewhere distant, she heard footsteps, the sound of water sprinklers outside, and birdsong carried by the wind. In the kitchen, sunlight streamed through tall glass doors, scattering across the ivory marble counters. James stood by the counter, back turned, wearing a white shirt with sleeves rolled to his forearms, holding a steaming pot of coffee. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Good morning," he said, his voice still deep but warmer now, touched with closeness. "Sleep well?" Beth nodded, smiling. "Better than I have in years. I almost forgot where I was." James poured her a cup and handed it over. Sometimes forgetting is a good thing. She took it, the warmth seeping into her palms. The aroma was rich, earthy, unlike the watery coffee she drank on rushed mornings. They didn't speak for a while. They simply sat together, gazing through the glass wall at the garden beyond, where sunlight fell over the lavender rows and ripened vines. Every leaf seemed edged with gold, glimmering as if painted by hand. After a simple breakfast of toast, eggs, and fresh fruit, James invited her to walk the grounds. Beth slipped into canvas shoes and a light jacket, walking beside him along a stone path bordered with wildflowers. He showed her the vineyard blocks where Cabernet grapes grew, where the oak barrels were stored, and the small barn where workers were, starting their morning. She noticed the way they greeted him with respect, softened by familiarity, as though he were not merely their employer, but the quiet guardian of this land. He spoke little, asked brief questions, smiled, nodded. When they passed a small garden corner, Beth stopped. On a stone bench beneath an old oak tree lay an open book, slightly weathered. James followed her gaze. "That's where I read at the end of the day," he said. "The quietest place on the property." Beth sat down, brushing her fingers across the faint moss on the bench. A light wind passed through, carrying the scent of leaves and earth. She looked up at him, her voice low. "Do you always live like this, peaceful, slow, complete?" He paused before answering. "Not always, but I chose this after years of the opposite." His words lingered in the air, and Beth fell silent. She too had once lived fast, chasing deadlines, fulfilling roles, existing for others rather than herself. But she had never allowed herself to stop, to simply be, not until now. No plans, no goals, just the morning, the open air, and a cup of coffee in her hand. When they returned to the house, the sun had climbed high. The vineyard shimmered in shades of green and gold. Beth walked slower, with no rush to be anywhere. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt herself breathing, truly breathing. Not to survive, not to endure, but to feel. Every step was lighter, every second carried its own quiet purpose. Something in the rhythm of this place, in the unforced way James moved through it, made her want to stay, just a little longer. One more day, one more morning, one more cup of coffee. Not for the beauty or the luxury, but for the stillness she had only just rediscovered after so long forgetting what peace felt like. That evening, after a day wandering the vineyards, tasting wines, and having lunch under the grape arbor, Beth and James sat together in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. No music, no phones, no television, only the firelight, the wine, and two souls at opposite ends of life's map, each carrying unspoken stories. James poured her half a glass of Pinot Noir and leaned back, his gaze lost in the flicker of the flames. Beth turned her glass slowly between her fingers before speaking. "Do you ever feel like you've gone too far to turn back?" James looked at her, not surprised, just attentive. "What do you mean?" She exhaled slowly. "That feeling when you've made too many wrong turns, when you're not sure you even remember how to live right anymore." He nodded slightly, as if he understood too well. "I know that feeling." She stared into her wine. "After the divorce, I thought I'd feel free, but mostly I felt empty. I don't regret leaving, but I regret losing myself long before that. For trying too hard to save something that was already gone." James said nothing, but his silence was a kind of presence, an open space that let her speak without fear. Beth went on, her voice steady. I used to believe that if I did everything right, my work, my motherhood, my marriage, then things would last. No one told me that some things aren't meant to be saved, not because we're not good enough, but because they've simply stopped being right. James set his glass down gently. Have you forgiven yourself? Beth turned, surprised by the question. I don't know. I think I'm still learning how. He smiled, not a polite smile, but the quiet, knowing smile of someone who had carried the same weight. Forgiving others is easy, he said softly. Forgiving yourself takes a lifetime. Beth waited a moment before asking, And you? Is there something you have not forgiven yourself for? James did not answer right away. He looked into the fire, the flames reflected in his eyes, giving his face a distant cast. I once put all my faith in a friend from my youth. One wrong decision made my family pay the price. After that, I spent years making amends, rebuilding, earning back the trust of those around me. But I have not forgotten the instant I lost everything because I trusted the wrong person. He paused, then turned to her. I have never told that to anyone who does not belong to my past. Beth said nothing, but her slight nod held a deep, quiet trust. She did not probe, did not ask him to explain, because she knew that everyone has wounds, and sometimes what matters is simply having someone patient enough to listen without trying to fix them. James stood and took a small wooden box from the bookshelf. He opened it to reveal old photographs, yellowed papers, several handwritten letters. I keep these to remind myself that nothing I have today is accidental. It is the long thread of losses and choices. Beth studied the photographs. There he was younger, with thicker hair, the same eyes as now, strong yet guarded. There was a photo of a red-haired woman laughing beside him, holding a little girl of about 5. James said softly, My former wife. She died of cancer 12 years ago. Beth set her hand on his without speaking. James was quiet for a long time. I have not loved anyone since, not because I do not want to, but because I fear I will break something again. She folded her fingers gently around his. I do not know what tomorrow will be, but tonight I am here, and I hear you. Not to judge, but to understand. James looked at her for a long time, and for the first time his gaze eased and softened, as if a door had quietly opened. In the crackle of the fire and the lingering scent of wine, there were no longer two strangers, but two souls drawing nearer, not out of hurried romance, but because their hurts had been named, shared, and held with the tender silence of a very real night. That night, after the long conversation by the hearth, Beth returned to her room with a quiet mind full of thought. She lay, on her side, her back pressed to the soft fabric of the pillow, her eyes following the pale orange glow of the lamp breathing across the ceiling. Outside, the Napa Valley was as still as a wordless song. No traffic, no mechanical noise, only wind slipping through the vines and crickets whispering sleep. But sleep did not come as quickly as she hoped. There was something in James's eyes when he spoke of the past that unsettled her. Not suspicion, but the blur of things left unfinished. Sometimes a long silence can hold more than a confession. Near midnight, as she drifted off, a small sound came from the hallway, light and quick, but enough to open her eyes. She was not nosy by habit, but the instincts honed from years as a single mother made her attentive to any unusual movement. She sat up, pulled on a thin robe, and opened the door. In the dim corridor, she saw James standing at the far end beside the room he had called his private library. The door was ajar, a narrow blade of yellow light cutting the dark, and his voice sounded low, hushed, taut. She did not intend to eavesdrop, but when she took one more step, she caught a sentence in Spanish. "Dile la marco que el consulador no aprueba el movimiento." The words made her stop cold. James switched to English immediately, his tone firmer than his usual calm. "I made it clear we do not move unless I give the direct order. No improvising. This is my territory." He went silent as if listening to the person on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, edged with chill. "I do not need to restate the rules, but if they have forgotten who runs this side, perhaps they need a clearer reminder." The last line felt like a blade drawn from a velvet sheath. Beth withdrew to her room and closed the door softly. She stood there with her heart beating slowly yet heavily. She did not grasp every detail, but words like territory and direct order, and especially the name the counselor would not let her look away. This was not the language of a vintner or a simple businessman. It was a voice of authority, a voice that made decisions whose consequences did not live only on paper. In that instant, Beth understood something essential. James Rourke was not only the quiet man among the vines. He was someone more than that, and perhaps more dangerous than that. The next morning, James behaved as if nothing had happened. He greeted her with a hot cup of coffee and a gentle smile, as though there had been no midnight call at all. Beth stayed easy in her manner and said nothing about what she had heard, but her eyes watched more closely. Each gesture, each pause. She began to notice that the people who came and went in the house did not look like ordinary staff. The driver from the day before was not merely a driver. The way his eyes swept the perimeter before settling on James was not the reflex of a chauffeur, but of a protector. And Daniel, the man who had met her at O'Hare, reappeared that afternoon without notice and murmured something into James's ear that darkened his expression for a brief moment. Beth sat in the back garden with a glass of water, her gaze on the lavender while her mind replayed what she had heard. She did not feel fear in the primal sense. James did not make her feel unsafe. On the contrary, he had been unfailingly gracious, measured, patient, but the truth was that he was not as simple as he had said, and even if he had not lied, he had not told everything. That did not erase what they had shared, but it told her she had stepped into a world with more layers than its surface, a world she might need to prepare to understand and accept, or else leave before it was too late. What shook her most was not what she had heard, but her own response. Rather than fear, she felt curiosity. Rather than run, she wanted to know, and deep down she knew their story had only just begun. That evening, after a simple meal of grilled meat and garden vegetables, Beth and James sat again on the veranda, where the lantern light fell softly on clusters of ripe grapes, glimmering in the dark. The air was heavier than usual, not because of any specific word, but because of a hush between them, as if both were waiting for the other to begin. Beth set her glass down, drew a steady breath, and spoke quietly without pretense. "I heard you on the phone last night." James did not look at her right away. His eyes stayed on the vineyard where the wind brushed the leaves. He was silent for a long moment before he answered, his voice even and slow. "I know." Beth nodded slightly. "I did not mean to, but I heard that name. The counselor. The way you spoke is not how hoteliers or vintners speak." James turned then, his gaze open and steady. "Because I do not only do those things." He stopped, weighing how much to say, then went on. "I was born in New Jersey. My family was not wealthy, but we had roots. My father worked as a coordinator for a network of business that was not official. No narcotics, no trafficking, but everything else was more flexible than the law would allow." He lifted his head and met her eyes with unguarded honesty. "I grew up in two worlds. On one side were men in suits who ran restaurants, hotels, parking lots. On the other side was the law that always suspected us. I was taught to choose my words, to keep distance, to never let anyone know what I truly did." Beth listened without interrupting. James continued, without bravado, without pride, only a simple permission granted at last to tell the truth. "I studied business, graduated, tried to do everything right, but after my father died, there were things I could not leave behind. Relationships, responsibilities. I do not run illegal operations, but I stand in the middle to make sure nothing spills out of control. They call me the counselor, the one who advises, who calms disputes, and sometimes the one who makes the final call." Beth said, "Nothing," her eyes steady and clear. James leaned back as if setting down a long carried weight. "I have spent the last 10 years making everything I can lawful. The hotels, the vineyard, the restaurant group, but the old threads remain. I will not deny that to you, because I do not want to begin anything built on a false premise." Beth lifted her glass again, her hand slightly unsteady, her voice calm. "Have you ever harmed anyone? An innocent person?" James did not blink. "No, that is the one line I never cross. At times I have forced people to decide. I have made them afraid to protect what I believe is right, but I do not touch those who are not involved. Never." Beth nodded and did not look away. Her heartbeat slowed. Something in his words made her believe him. Not entirely by logic, but with the instinct of a woman who has weathered enough hurt to know when someone is telling the truth. "Thank you for not hiding this," she said softly. James leaned forward. "I will understand if you want to leave. This life is not for everyone." Beth smiled faintly and tilted her head. I have not said I will stay, but I have not said I will go. Perhaps I need one more morning. And one more glass of wine. James looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled as well. It was not a smile to conceal anything, but a lightening of the air, as if for a brief instant in the quiet Napa night he had found a small holdfast in his layered world. And Beth, though she had no final answer, knew that a part of her had stepped deeper into this story and was not yet ready to turn back. The next morning, James invited Beth to take a drive through Sonoma, not far from the villa. She agreed, partly out of curiosity, partly because after the honesty of the previous evening, something between them had quietly shifted. They left the house around 9. The sky was clear, the sunlight gentle, the breeze scented faintly with pine needles and dry wood. James drove himself, no driver this time, and Beth realized it was the first time she had seen him behind the wheel. The black SUV hummed softly along winding valley roads, past vineyards near the end of harvest, past wooden cottages with white fences and late-blooming roses. He drove with the calm precision of habit, one hand resting lightly on the wheel, the other pointing out small roadside diners, old wine shops, and gas stations he remembered from his youth. Beth sat beside him, watching the scenery slide past her window, feeling a quiet stillness settle inside her, as though the distance between them had shrunk without her noticing. They reached the town square of Sonoma by late morning. The small streets lay under the shade of old oak trees. The brick buildings had become bookshops, artisanal cafes, and stores selling cheese and local wine. James took her to a pastry shop called Flora, where an elderly server greeted him by name with easy warmth. He smiled, returned the greeting, and pulled out a chair for Beth. They ordered lemon tarts and hot coffee, sitting outside beneath a canopy of golden leaves drifting lazily down. Beth was surprised by how many faces James remembered the names of clerks, old patrons, even the small terrier trotting beside the candle shop owner across the street. She had thought of him as private, isolated within his own world, but today she saw something different. He was not alone. He belonged here, quietly but deeply. After lunch at a small Italian restaurant where they shared lasagna and aged red wine, they wandered through the streets and stepped into a used bookstore. Beth was drawn to the section of old classics, where leather-bound novels stood stacked in the amber glow of reading lamps. James didn't say much. He simply stood beside her, occasionally pulling down a book, handing it to her, or asking if she had read it. She picked up a novel she'd loved in college, smiled faintly, and asked, "Do you remember every book you've read?" He smiled back, the same gentle look he'd worn the night before. "I remember how they made me feel, the way I remember how it felt sitting beside you on that plane that night." The words left her silent, not from embarrassment, but from the quiet recognition they stirred. She looked at him longer this time, and for the first time, didn't try to resist whatever had been forming between them. It wasn't impulse or simple attraction. It was recognition, the moment when two people, among countless others, happened to stop in the same place, at the same time, in the same state of heart, and see each other. On the drive back, the sky softened with clouds. The mountains in the distance blurred under a faint veil of evening mist. James didn't turn on the radio, and Beth didn't ask him to. She rested her head lightly against the window, watching the road ahead, then said softly, "Today felt real." James glanced at her, smiling. "Yes, and easy. No plans, no masks." She nodded, then said almost to herself, "You're not what I thought at first." He raised a brow. "And what was that? Cold, controlled, full of secrets." He laughed quietly. "Still full of secrets, but I'm trying to keep fewer." She laughed too, not in irony but in understanding. When the car turned down the familiar lane leading back to the villa, Beth saw again the red roof, the vine trellises, the gentle trickle of water in the courtyard fountain. And she knew, deep down, that something in her had changed. Among the cobbled streets of Sonoma, over a cup of coffee and an old book, she and James had moved closer, not through declarations or promises, but simply by being present long enough that neither wished to return to life as it had been before. That evening, after their return from Sonoma, James suggested they build a small fire in the garden. Beth was surprised, but she didn't refuse. He said it was a habit from childhood, when his family lived in New Jersey, and autumn nights were excuses for everyone to gather by the flames. He prepared everything himself, with practiced ease. When she stepped outside, The fire was already burning steadily, fed by carefully stacked logs. The wooden chairs were arranged in a circle, 2 glasses of red wine waiting on a small side table. The moon was not full, but bright, and its silver light spread over the vineyard like a soft mist, slowing the world into a quiet rhythm. Beth sat across from him, accepting the glass he handed her. For a long time, neither spoke. They simply watched the fire, listened to the gentle crackle of wood and the wind whispering through the trees. The silence was complete, but not empty. It was the kind that asked for nothing more. James spoke first. He told her about the first fire he built at 12, how he once dreamed of becoming a chef instead of inheriting a chain of restaurants and the weight of family duty. Beth told him about the summer when she was 14, camping, with her parents in Oregon, crying because she couldn't start a fire after hours of trying. They both laughed quiet, unguarded laughter that seemed to draw them closer. As the flames sank into embers, James rose, went inside, and returned with a soft wool blanket. He draped it over her shoulders, bending slightly, his hand lingering just a moment longer than necessary. She looked up, and in that instant their eyes met without haste, without defense. This time, James sat beside her, closer than before. "I know I carry a lot of unanswered questions," he said slowly, "but there's one thing I've been certain of since that night at the airport. You make me want to live differently. Not to start over, but to live differently." Beth didn't answer right away. She looked at the dying fire, then at him, studying her own heart as if testing whether it could still trust itself. She didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel uncertain. She simply saw a man with stories not yet told, sitting beside her like any other man on an ordinary night in a quiet place filled only with silence and tender light. Beth turned her face toward him, and this time she was the one who leaned in first. The kiss arrived without warning, yet without haste, their mouths touching as lightly as if they feared to break the fragile moment they had made. It was only a brush, just enough to still the world around them. James set his hand to her cheek, his fingertips grazing her hair as if to etch the feeling there. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but carried more than anything they had said to each other. When they parted, Beth did not pull away, and she did not speak. She rested her head on his shoulder, and James wrapped an arm around her, holding her gently. There were no vows, no promises, only 2 people who had found each other at the very hour when their hearts needed a place to believe. In the tender dark and the fading firelight, they sat without asking for any further answer, because there are moments when a single light touch and a shared breath are enough to understand that something has begun and neither of them wishes to lose it. The next morning when Beth woke, James was no longer in the sitting room. She stepped into the back garden where the previous night's fire lay cold, only a few blackened coals left, and the wool blanket he had laid over her neatly folded on a chair. The morning air was pure yet carried a strangeness, as though the peace they had touched the night before had been only a temporary shelter. Beth walked inside and called his name softly. No answer. She was about to return to her room to change when she heard footsteps in the hall and saw James appear, but not as the man who had sat beside her at the fire. He wore a black buttoned shirt to the collar, his face composed, his eyes not meeting hers as they usually did, the gaze of someone counting variables rather than a man who had shared a first kiss with the woman he cared for. Beth stood still, watching him, waiting for an explanation. He only inclined his head and passed by as if something heavier than words had claimed him. She followed him to the study and stopped at the threshold. The door stood slightly ajar, enough for her to see a stranger seated opposite James, a tall man in a gray suit, his manner cold and controlled. A thick file lay open on the table, several sheets scattered, yet the eyes of both men did not leave each other. Beth could not make out the words, but the air inside felt dense and metallic, a tension so complete it chilled her. She stepped back, returned to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed, her mind spinning with the sensation of being pushed away from a world she had not yet fully entered. An hour later, James came to find her. He knocked softly, though strain still shadowed his eyes. "I am sorry," he said, his voice roughened as if by a long negotiation. "I had to meet someone from the past, something that would not wait." Beth kept, her tone even. "What is happening, James?" He was silent for a beat, then answered slowly. "A man who was once a partner and is no longer. He has returned to demand what is no longer his. And I cannot yield." Beth stepped closer, searching his face. "Should I be afraid?" James looked into her and shook his head. "No. I will not let anything touch you." She knew that when a man had to say those words aloud, danger stood near. He took her hand and held it, but something in his eyes had already closed. The closeness of the firelit night seemed to have met an invisible wall rising between them. For the first time since she had arrived, Beth felt a part of James she could not reach, a part he had long kept sealed, and that now had risen to reclaim its ground. All that day, James withdrew into quiet. He stayed in the study, spoke only when necessary, no longer the man who told gentle stories over dinner or listened to her small thoughts. Beth tried to keep to the ordinary, walking the rows of vines, reading in the parlor. Yet her mind hovered at the half-closed door at the end of the hall where the man she was learning to trust faced something she did not yet understand. By evening, when she brought tea, he only thanked her without lifting his eyes from the phone. She turned away with a nameless feeling, both worried and sad, recognizing that the night by the fire, with all its tenderness, might have been a pause before a coming storm, and that James, who had opened himself to her, was returning to the armor he had worn most of his life. The next 3 days passed in a taut stillness unlike anything she had felt since arriving. James remained present, dined with her, stayed courteous and kind, poured wine and asked if she had slept well, yet something in his gaze had stepped back. She felt the separation keenly, not loud or obvious, but an invisible distance forming by degrees, as if he were easing out of every bond before it grew too strong. She was not fragile, not a woman to be carried off by a kiss or a romantic supper. Yet these 3 days left her feeling like an extra in the story she had once been invited into, believing herself a part of it, now set aside without explanation. That morning Beth woke earlier than usual, sleepless and heavy with unanswered questions. She went down to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood looking over the vineyard turning the pale gold of early autumn. James entered soon after, as on every morning, but instead of the light smile and the brief kiss to her brow of the first days, he only nodded. Beth set her cup on the table and met his eyes. "James, I need you to tell me the truth," she said, firm but not harsh. "What is happening? Who was the man the other day, and why have you changed?" He stopped and held her gaze for a long beat, as if deciding how far he could go and what he must hold back. At last he exhaled and sat opposite. "Beth, some things are not simple to explain, not because I do not trust you, but because they are not purely white or black." She would not accept that. "Then show me the gray, James. I did not come here to live inside a pretty dream for a few weeks. I have seen you differently. I have trusted you. But I cannot sit in the dark while the air around you roils. At least give me the right to know where I stand and beside whom." He closed his eyes for a brief second, as if her words had brushed a wound he had hidden too well. "The man is Anthony Grimaldi," he said slowly. "Once a business partner to my family, now he wants back in. He wants control of certain lines we still hold, but this is not just business. It is power and influence and a network, and I cannot let it happen." Beth swallowed and felt her heart draw tight. The pieces slid into place, the midnight calls, the way others in town inclined their heads to James, the look in the stranger's eyes. "You are speaking of something outside the law, are you not?" she asked softly. James did not blink. "I do not touch narcotics. I do not touch human trafficking. I do not harm the innocent. But I belong to a world where the rules do not live only on paper. In that world, a promise weighs more than a contract, and honor can demand a price in blood." A part of her wanted to run, to refuse the shape of what she was hearing, but another part remembered James tending the vines, listening to her talk about work, laying his hand at her back as they crossed a street, touching his lips to her forehead each morning. That man was not a villain. Yet he belonged to a world where the lines between right and wrong no longer held a simple edge. "Then why did you bring me here?" she asked, almost a whisper. James rose and stepped closer, his voice low but clear. "Because from the first moment I saw you through the glass at the airport, I knew I was about to change. I could not let you step into my life without a choice, but I also could not step out of yours without fighting first." Beth looked at him for a long time. She did not know what she would do, only that for the first time she truly stood between two edges. On one side the safety she knew, on the other the world of James, complex, dangerous, and so real she could not look away. James was silent for a long while after Beth's last question. In that moment there was only the wind slipping through the half-open window and the slow tick of the kitchen clock in the early light. Then he left his chair and motioned for her to follow. Without speaking, he led her down the hall and opened a door she had never seen him enter. It was a smaller study, discreet, its walls lined with books of law, folders of documents, and maps of the economy of Northern California. On the desk sat a computer that had been shut down and a small wooden box locked with an old brass clasp. James turned the key, took out a sheaf of papers, set them on the desk, and invited Beth to sit. There was no guardedness now, no held distance. In his eyes lived a long fatigue, as if what he was about to say had been buried too many years, heavy enough to bend the back of the one who carried it. I was born into a family that has made wine for 3 generations, but not only wine, he began, his voice even and unhurried. My grandfather was the first to expand into logistics, moving goods between Napa, Sonoma, and the port of Oakland. By the time I was 10, I was hearing phone calls about special consignments that needed to pass without official oversight. Beth held her breath and did not interrupt. James kept his gaze on hers. We called them gray transactions, not fully illegal but not within the white. For example, importing high-end wines without taxes because we shipped directly from Italy, from Barolo. We distributed to fine restaurants in New York and Los Angeles, without reporting all the revenue. The goods were not dangerous or poisonous, only a way of stepping around the law. Beth nodded slightly, but he did not stop. We also handled financing for small vineyards on the verge of default, and in return they ceded to us the right to harvest and to set prices for 10 years. Legally, it was a commercial contract. Morally, not everyone agreed. Some called it a takeover. Some called it protecting heritage. He gave a thin smile that was not mockery but resignation. You see, Beth, not the Mafia you see in films. No guns or knives, but not a spotless businessman either. I stand in the middle like my father did before me. The difference is that I do not want the spiral to go on. Beth looked at him and felt part of her mind want to react, to protest, to ask why he had not chosen the lawful path from the start. Yet deep down she understood. James was not excusing himself. He was laying himself bare, stepping into the quiet courtroom where she alone served as judge, where she alone could forgive or walk away. And Grimaldi? She asked, her voice strangely calm. James nodded as if he had been waiting for that question. He is the part I do not want to keep. 10 years ago, my family worked with him on certain shipments of rare goods, black truffles, wines restricted by international scarcity rules, even art antiquities. When my father died, I inherited our share, but I wanted out of those dealings. He did not. Grimaldi wanted the Rourke name to launder larger, more perilous plays. When I refused, he disappeared, until now. Beth said nothing. Her heart tangled like the vines behind the house. What kept her from turning away was the look in James's eyes when he spoke of his father, of the legacy he had not chosen and yet bore, and of the limits he had drawn for himself in a world that asked no one to draw any. Have you hurt anyone? She asked softly. James shook his head. Never. Not an innocent. Not women. Not children. Not anyone unconnected. That is the line I never cross. Beth studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since the conversation began, she stepped closer and laid her hand over his. You may not be perfect, but you have principles. That matters. James lifted his head, a narrow thread of hope brightening his eyes. Are you not afraid? Beth shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. Yes, a little, but I am more afraid of losing someone who dared to show me his darkest rooms without hiding. I do not know where this will take us, but I want to stay. At least to know I did not turn away simply because it was not easy. James closed his fingers around hers as if he had been allowed to breathe after days of holding his breath. No thanks were spoken or needed. The pressure of his hand said everything. In that moment there were no gray statutes or ethical margins. Only a man who had stripped off the garment of power to be human, and a woman who chose to remain after seeing all that was imperfect in the one she was coming to love. Beth sat alone on the long bench beneath the eaves of the wooden house, the last light of the day pouring over the Napa Valley, like warm honey, golden and hushed. Far off, the vineyard rows stood still in the faint wind, as if guarding the secrets of generations. In her hands was a cup of tea still hot, yet her fingers were cold and her heart colder. The conversation with James from the night before ran word for word through her mind. He had been honest, more than anyone she had known. That truth, though, was a blade with 2 edges, worthy and frightening at once. He had not lied, had not embellished, had not hidden. He had let her see him exactly as he was, even the shadowed corners that might have sent her away forever. That made everything harder. If James had been only a wealthy man entangled in murky dealings who tried to conceal them, she might have left long ago. But he was not that. He had limits, rules, principles he had never broken despite the power to do so. Even so, she could not deny that his world was another country, distant, intricate, and risky. If she stayed, she would be choosing to live. With that unease, with secrets that could not yet be spoken, with unexpected meetings at midnight, with names like Grimaldi that would not vanish, and with moral choices that would not always appear in black and white. Beth thought of her mother in Minnesota, a woman who had dreamed her daughter would marry a decent man who worked at a bank or as an engineer and live a safe and sufficient life. She thought of her friends, people living ordinary days with safe relationships and endings easy to predict, people who would never take a phone call at 3 a.m. from a man who carried a shadow with him. Then she thought of James, the man who had seen her through airport glass and done the unthinkable, the man who asked for her presence instead of demanding anything, who gave her a choice at every step, who stood back when she needed quiet, and who put every truth on the table because he believed she was strong enough to receive it. From the beginning to this very hour, James had not once asked her to stay. He had not pleaded or persuaded. He had only opened a door and waited for her to walk through if she wished. That did not press upon her. It made her feel deeply respected. She was not naive. She understood that if she continued, she would be loving not only a man, but the shaded world behind him, a place where every word carried weight, every connection bore subtext, and every decision would touch more lives than her own. Yet she had never felt so alive, so clear to herself, so brave, so true. James did not only make her feel loved, he made her feel chosen, not because he needed someone to accompany him, but because he wanted her beside him as a true companion. That, to Beth, was worth more than all promises of a safe life. The light thinned, and the wind turned sharp. Beth stood and walked into the house where James waited in silence. She saw his silhouette through the doorway, the same posture, shoulders slightly bowed, hands clasped, eyes turned to the garden, like a man awaiting a verdict. When she entered, he looked up, and for a heartbeat his gaze held everything, worry and hope and the readiness to let go if he must. Beth did not speak. She simply stepped forward and laid her hand over his, light but sure. "I never thought I would travel this far, only to find the question I truly needed to answer," she whispered. "And now I know. What I fear is not your past. It is not being present in your future." James did not smile, and he did not speak. He only stood and drew her into his arms as if one wrong movement might shatter the fragile moment. In that embrace, Beth knew she had chosen, not a perfect man, but a real one, and that was enough. 3 days after Beth made her choice, the air on the estate tightened like a drawn string, although no one said so. James rose earlier than usual, his phone always within reach, hushed calls in Italian woven with names familiar and strange. Beth did not ask, but she knew that everything was moving toward an unavoidable point. That night, when she stepped into the study, James stood beside a map of the Sonoma region, red marks spread across it like a silent chessboard. He turned at the sound of the door, his eyes as deep and grave as the first time she had seen him on the plane. "Tomorrow I will meet Grimaldi," James said plainly. "One last time." Beth moved closer, the desk lamp laying every line of weariness bare on his face. "Are you certain?" James nodded and said nothing more. It would not be an ordinary meeting. It would be a match of strategy, each side bringing its own pieces, staking history and power, and things that could not be counted. The next morning, Beth watched the black Bentley roll down the drive, James in the rear seat with Victor beside him, the quiet bodyguard who had shadowed him since she arrived in Napa. She stood a long time on the porch, the coffee in her cup grown cold, her eyes fixed on the red dirt road leading to the highway. For the first time she understood what it meant to love a man who lived in a world where a single conversation could alter the course of a life. The meeting was arranged at an abandoned winery north of Petaluma, a neutral ground that belonged to neither side. When James stepped inside, Grimaldi was already there, sitting quietly at a battered wooden table with a half-burned cigar between his fingers and the look of a man who had been waiting for him for many years. "James Rourke," Grimaldi said, his voice low but edged with challenge. "It has been a long time. You have become your father." James did not sit at once. He scanned the room where 2 other men stood in silence, Grimaldi's protection, though they did not carry visible weapons. "I came to end this," James said, and only then did he pull out a chair and face him. "We are too old for posturing, and you know I am done playing the old games." Grimaldi's mouth tilted. "You talk as if you are the righteous man in a fallow, filthy world." James did not rise to it. "I am no saint, but I have limits. Dragging my name into what you are planning crosses those limits." Grimaldi drew on the cigar and let the smoke go slowly. "I need the Rourke name, the weight your father's reputation had. The network you control is worth 3 times more standing beside me." James shook his head. "You do not need me. You need a ghost to cover things dirtier than anything my father ever touched. I will not sell my name at any price." Grimaldi leaned back, his eyes darkening. "You think you get to choose. I have staked money on deals you refused. I lost face when you pulled out. You imagine the consequence will be a few hard looks around town." James did not budge. "I am not here to beg. I am here to give a final choice. If you withdraw from Sonoma, stop using my name on any document, and cut every indirect tie to the facilities under my management, I will not open the old files. There will be no investigation, no press, no mention of you anywhere for 6 months. I hold my silence. But if you refuse," he paused, his gaze sharp as a blade, "I will use everything I have to make your name the first target for the federal forces." Grimaldi gave a short laugh. "You think I fear the Federal Bureau?" "No," James answered evenly. "I think you fear being pushed from the table." A long quiet stretched after that line. Grimaldi took another, deeper pull on the cigar, then ground it hard into a chipped ashtray and stood. "Very much your father, only more stubborn. All right, Rourke, I will step back. But the next time you put your hand into my affairs, I will not be so polite." James rose and said nothing. The 2 men held each other's eyes one last time, then turned and walked away in opposite directions like 2 worlds that had once intersected and now drew apart. When James returned to the estate, Beth was in the greenhouse watering plants. He went straight to her without a word and squeezed her hand gently from behind. She turned and saw in his eyes something released, not exhaustion but relief. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. James nodded. "I am. I have chosen." Beth laid her palm against his chest and felt the steady beat beneath his shirt. "I am proud of you." He said nothing, only bent and kissed her forehead. In that instant, in the soft green of leaves and the whispering wind, Beth knew everything had shifted, not to an ending but to a true beginning. 2 days after the meeting with Grimaldi, the estate's rhythms settled back into their old cadence, but Beth did not. She no longer felt as lost or anxious as before, yet a low hush moved through her, something she could not name, part peace and part cooled fear. James spent most of his time near her and spoke little about the negotiation, saying only that things were resolved and that nothing would touch them. Beth knew he was doing more than protecting her. He was setting aside a part of himself for her. That afternoon they sat together on the old porch swing, Beth leaning into his shoulder while birds sang and the wind slipped through the vines. He squeezed her hand as if to confirm something unspoken. "You know you can leave at any time," James said, his voice as soft as air. "If you want to go back to Chicago, if all of this is too much, I will drive you to the airport without a word of blame." Beth straightened and met his gaze, the same eyes that had once felt distant and were now the safest place in the world. "I do not want to go anywhere," she said, clear and sure. "I have watched you hold your ground, seen you choose peace when you could have chosen vengeance, watched you do everything without losing your humanity. I am not afraid of your world, James. I am afraid of not belonging to it." James closed his eyes as if her words had lifted a stone that had been on his heart for a very long time. He pulled her close, holding her until she could hear his heartbeat slow and sure. "Do you know what you are choosing?" he whispered. Beth nodded in his arms. "I choose you, not because you are perfect, but because you are real. I choose everything that comes with you, the beautiful and the complicated, and I do not want to step back." They sat like that for a long while without speaking. The last light washed the rows of vines, gold, and the wind through the trees played a quiet song without words. That evening, James took Beth to the back garden where Victor had already built a small fire. They toasted marshmallows and laughed softly over stories without beginnings or endings. And when night fell, Beth looked up at the bright field of stars and felt the old fears dissolve. This was not the life she had imagined, or the straight road she had once planned. Yet its very surprise had given her what she had not dared to believe she would have again: a place to belong, someone to trust, a reason to stay. When they went back inside, James held her hand as if afraid she might change her mind. Beth did not. Her decision had been made the moment she first saw him through the airport glass, and everything after had been the heart's way of confirming that this time, at last, she had chosen the right man. 2 months after that tight embrace on the porch when Beth whispered that she would stay, life settled between them into an oddly steady rhythm, so peaceful that at times she wondered if they were living in a small, bright pause the universe had set aside just for them. Each morning she rose a little before James and made coffee exactly the way he liked it, then carried it out to the balcony. He would appear after her with his hair a little mussed and a gray shirt and the last of sleep in his eyes, and the moment he saw her, everything softened. They sat side by side, drinking in silence, and watching the first light pour through the rows of vines as if everything else in the world could wait, but this moment could not be missed. Beth still worked remotely, advising a few small companies on brand strategy, but her schedule was freer and kinder now. She had room to breathe and to live and to see herself growing not through stacked meetings and thick spreadsheets, but in the way she listened when James spoke, in the way she stepped into the kitchen to help Rosa bake, in the way she tended the small pots of herbs in the backyard. James kept steering his enterprises, only now Beth was part of every decision, not by intrusion but because he turned to her and asked a single question. "What do you think?" At first she was startled to be asked about meetings with partners or plans to invest in a new winery, but she came to understand that to James, she was not only the woman he loved but the companion at his side. They kept their evenings for each other, sometimes cooking, sometimes walking the property under the moon, sometimes simply lying together reading. Once Beth brought home a novel she had loved in college and read him a few passages, and he listened without missing a word, as if it were a piece of music he had never known. One afternoon, while they were organizing papers in his study, she came across an old photograph nestled among documents, James as a boy beside a man she knew must be his father. The boy's eyes so like the man beside her now, only without the shadow. She set it back gently and said nothing, and he said nothing in return, and they both understood. Their love was not loud. It was woven from small gestures, knowing silences, and the patience to move together through the layered past. An email arrived from a company in New York inviting her to return full-time for a generous salary, a beautiful office, and a clear path upward. She let it sit for a few days and then quietly deleted it, not because she refused opportunity but because she had chosen a different life, one that might never be glamorous, that might have fewer grand meetings, but one with a man who kept her at the center of his days, with calm mornings and wind, and a peace she had not touched for many years. There was much still to face. She knew that, yet she was no longer afraid. She had chosen, and the choice grew truer with each day. One morning in May, when the light had turned warm and the vines were a bright green in the early breeze, James sat across from Beth at the table, and in a voice so light it caught her heart said, "Next week I want to take you to meet my mother in Carmel Valley." Beth blinked and set down her cup, her pulse jumping without reason. They had been living together for 2 months, had weathered more than a few turns, and come to know each other more deeply than any relationship she had known. Yet meeting a mother brought its own invisible weight, all the more when that mother was the mother of James Rourke, a man not only wealthy and private, but a man who had walked the thin lines between the lawful world and the gray that defies easy definition. Beth nodded and kept her voice steady. "I would love to meet her." James only smiled, a quiet look that told her he knew this was a threshold and that she had chosen to cross it. That weekend they drove the Pacific Coast Highway along its winding arcs above the sea. Beth had never been to Carmel Valley, but the moment they entered that serene country, she understood why James had chosen it for his mother. The house rested on a gentle hill among lavender and old olive trees, simple and refined, with the tranquil beauty of the woman who came to the door. James's mother was small, her cropped silver hair neat, her eyes keen and warm. She did not speak much at first. She held her son for a long moment, then turned to Beth with a light smile and said, "At last you have brought her." Beth felt her heart ease. They ate lunch in the back garden, where sunlight sifted through branches and birdsong mingled with the scent of herbs, a meal she had prepared herself, simple and astonishingly good: grilled salmon, homemade bread, a salad of greens grown behind the house. Beth was not a quick maker of small talk, but with James's mother she did not feel the need to try. The woman had a way of making one feel seen without being scrutinized. Afterward, while James went to the car for their bags, She poured Beth a cup of herb tea and led her under the trellis. They sat a while in the quiet before she spoke, her voice low and very clear. "My son is a good man, but he lives in a complicated world. I never expect anyone to understand all that he must do. I only hope the person beside him is strong enough not to be pulled in or lost." Beth set down her cup and raised her eyes. "I know who he is. I know his past, the shadows, and the things most people would not touch. But I have never seen him lose his compassion. I stay because he has always let me choose, without pressure and without hiding. I choose him. I choose all of it, and I do not regret it." She was silent for a long moment, and then smiled. "Good. I have not seen him this peaceful since his father died." When James returned to find the two women seated together, his mother's gaze gentle and Beth's steady, he only lifted the corner of his mouth and sat between them as if, at last, things were coming into place. That evening, driving away from Carmel, James held Beth's hand and said nothing, but his fingers closed around hers with firm certainty, and Beth rested her head on his shoulder, feeling that another door had opened between them. She had stepped into his world, and now that world was widening, wide enough to welcome her. That afternoon sunlight spilled through the dense canopy of vines, washing the garden behind the estate in gold. Beth sat on the wooden steps with a glass of cold lemonade, watching James and Victor repair the frame of the old trellis. He wore a plain white shirt, rolled-up jeans, his face beaded with sweat, yet his eyes alight. Something in the way he looked at her that morning had made her heart miss a beat, not from fear, but from the quiet certainty of a beginning. As dusk softened toward evening, James washed his hands, changed his shirt, and returned to the porch where she sat. He reached out a hand without speaking. Beth raised her brows but smiled and let him pull her up. They walked slowly through the vineyard, following the narrow path that wound toward the back hill, to the old oak where they had once sat beneath the moon, where Beth had told him of childhood dreams and the small heartbreaks of youth. At the base of the tree now stood a small wooden table and 2 chairs. A bottle of wine lay open, 2 crystal glasses catching the last amber light. Beth stopped short, her heartbeat quickening. James pulled out a chair for her, poured the wine, still silent. Their glasses touched, their eyes met, and in that instant she knew what was coming. Yet he still found a way to surprise her, not with spectacle or grand words, but with the truth in his voice and the unguarded warmth in his gaze. He rose, circled the table, and knelt before her, not too fast, not too slow, as though it were the most natural act of his life. "Beth Carter," he said, eyes steady on hers, opening a small velvet box. Inside was a deep sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds, elegant and timeless, much like her. From the first moment at the airport, when you sat there among strangers with that look in your eyes searching for a place to belong, I knew I could not let the moment pass. You chose to board that plane though you did not know who I was. You chose to stay even after knowing all the reasons you might run. And each day since, I have known more clearly that I want you to be the last face I see before sleep, and the first hand I hold each morning. Beth could no longer breathe. Her hand trembled as he held it, his eyes brighter than any stone. "Marry me," he said softly. "Be my wife. Choose me again. Choose this life and everything that comes with it. I will not promise it will always be simple, but I promise it will always be true." A tear slid down her cheek, not of shock but of recognition, for deep inside she had always known her answer. Hearing those words here, in this light, made it feel like a dream written only for her. She knelt before him, both hands framing his face, as though afraid he might vanish. "Yes," she whispered, then laughed through her tears. "The biggest yes of my life. The best yes I ever gave." James did not wait another heartbeat. He drew her into his arms and kissed her, as if every barrier between them had dissolved. The evening wind swept over the hill, leaves whispering like voices blessing them. And in the midst of the glowing vineyard, beneath the gold of sunset and the blue of promise, their wild, improbable, beautiful love story found another chapter. A morning in early autumn, sunlight the color of honey poured through the stained glass of a small church perched on a hill, in Sonoma, where the endless vines stretched to the horizon, and the wind carried its quiet benediction through the leaves. In the warm air filled with white flowers, candlelight, and the gentle strains of strings, Beth walked slowly down the aisle. Her dress was simple and graceful, her bouquet a bundle of lavender with sprigs of olive. Her eyes met James's at the altar, in his charcoal suit, his gaze never leaving her, They were married not by the nod between verses of a hymn, but by the long road that had brought them here, from a glance through airport glass to nights spent sharing the hidden corners of their souls. When the priest asked who would tell the story of how they met, laughter rippled through the room. James took Beth's hand, turned toward the guests, and said with half a smile, half a tease, "She missed her flight. I had a plane. The rest is history." Laughter filled the church, but in every face there was the quiet understanding that this was not luck, it was fate. For among millions who cross paths each day, some pairs of eyes pause, some wild choices lead exactly where we belong. The reception took place in the vineyard behind the house, the very spot where James had proposed. Long tables glowed under strings of golden lights, wild flowers, and bottles of wine aged for this day. Family, friends, everyone dear to them was there. Sarah, Beth's closest friend, leaned in to whisper, "I still can't believe you're marrying a man you met because of a flight delay. But my God, you look happier than I've ever seen you. Best decision you ever made." Beth laughed through tears and hugged her friend as though embracing a whole past life. When night fell, she and James stood beneath the shimmering lights, hands entwined, looking at each other as if everything were beginning again, this time forever. Their story might have started with an impulsive act, but what kept it alive was the choice made each day, the faith that bridges imperfection, the courage to face fear, and still move toward love. Perhaps not everyone gets invited onto a private plane, but each person has a moment to choose a new journey. Sometimes the choices that seem the most reckless are the ones that lead us home to what our hearts have long been seeking. If you have listened until now, thank you for giving this story your time. What about you? Have you ever stood at the edge of a decision that seemed unreasonable, yet turned out to change your life? Do you believe a single bold leap can open an entirely new world? Share your thoughts below. We would love to hear the truths and feelings that live in your heart. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the stories we tell each day, tales filled with tenderness and humanity. If this story touched you, please like and share it so that its light might reach others. Thank you for walking with us through every chapter. May you and those you love be blessed with health, peace, and joy in every day ahead. Until next time.